Hi, I'm Dr. Suzette Glassner, clinical psychologist and associate professor of psychiatry at UCLA. Today, I want to talk about a topic that has been a great source of debate in both the scientific and medical communities, and that is the question of whether drinking alcohol has health benefits. So, the idea that alcohol could be beneficial from one's health, especially if consumed in moderate quantities, was born from epidemiological studies, and those are population-based studies that look at health trends and the prevalence or the proportion of the population that is affected by certain diseases. And the idea that alcohol use could be protective against certain types of illnesses, such as stroke and heart attack, came largely from these epidemiological studies that showed that particularly among middle-aged and older men and women, in Western countries where stroke and heart attack are major sources or leading causes of mortality, that drinking alcohol was associated with lower risk of mortality from these particular causes. A number of studies also added to that literature that showed some other potential health benefits. These studies showed that drinking alcohol could increase what we refer to as good HDL cholesterol and can reduce the presence of certain proteins in the blood that can contribute to blood clots and therefore to stroke and heart attack. And research has also shown that drinking is correlated with a lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes, along with other common health difficulties such as gallstones. And one of the things that is important to keep in mind when you're looking at correlational research is that there could be two things that seem to be associated with one another. So people who drink certain amounts of alcohol could show an association between drinking and reduced risk of certain diseases. But one of the things that if you take courses in statistics and you learn about what correlations mean, they really only tell part of the story. So just because two things are happening in greater likelihood together, it doesn't mean that one actually caused the other. Further research needs to be done in order to figure out what is underlying that association or what is causing those two things to be related. So you don't want to jump to the conclusion that just because two things are correlated that one causes the other. And that might be part of the trap that we've fallen into in terms of interpreting these correlational studies around alcohol use and the incidence or likelihood of some of these diseases, because a very recent study has been published over the last couple of years that included over 1 billion individuals across the world and took a look at that relationship between moderate quantities of alcohol use and disease risk. And it found something very different. And you might wonder, why are you giving this one study so much credibility? And part of the reason is that the larger a study is in terms of the more people you include in a study, the more what we call statistical power you have. And statistical power is a concept in quantitative analysis that essentially means when you have a really small group of people and you're trying to study population trends, what you see may not be something that would generalize to larger groups of people, to the broader population. And in particular, when you're trying to make comparisons between different groups of people and what disease outcomes they have and how that relates to something like drinking, again, the more people you have in each of those groups to compare to one another, the more confident you can be in what the statistics are telling you about whether what you're seeing is just because of chance or whether it's really a systematic relationship that you could replicate over and over again. So when we see a study with a large sample size, like 1 billion people, that's studying smaller subgroups, those who drink, those who don't drink, those who live in certain countries, those who live in other countries, and you're comparing them all to one another to try to identify trends, you can be a lot more more confident that the trends that you're seeing are meaningful when you have that larger sample size. So it's really meaningful that we have a study now that included over 1 billion individuals and looked at the relationship of their disease status in terms of cardiovascular and other illnesses that have been demonstrated in prior smaller studies to be tied with alcohol use and quantities of alcohol use. And what this study found was that there are no health benefits to drinking alcohol for individuals who are under the age of 40. And in fact, there are quite a few health risks associated with drinking alcohol, really across the lifespan. So if you are a drinker, you're somebody who likes to consume alcohol, this doesn't mean that you shouldn't consume any alcohol at all, but it is informative in that if you're drinking alcohol and you're under 40 and you're doing it because you feel like it has health benefits, that has not borne out to be true according to the most recent and valid and reliable research studies that we have available to draw on. This younger group of people who are under 40 not only are susceptible to health risks and harms that are related to alcohol use, such as suicides related to drinking, injuries, and motor vehicle accidents, but alcohol consumption did not benefit their health or reduce their risk of chronic diseases as was once thought. Okay, so what about individuals who are over 40? So that's what we found for people who are under 40. What if you're over 40? Is drinking good for you? Again, the relationship between alcohol use and chronic diseases is somewhat complex, but according to this study, people who are over 40 may see some health benefits from alcohol use, including reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, stroke, and diabetes. But there are a few caveats that you should be aware of. So the reduced risks of those chronic diseases were not present among every single person who was over the age of 40. It was only among those who were over the age of 40 who did not have other underlying chronic conditions. So if you're someone who's over 40 and you have a chronic illness of some kind, this doesn't actually apply to you. If you are completely healthy, 45, 50, 55, or 60-year-old, and you are interested in drinking for the health benefits of alcohol, you may experience some health benefits of alcohol in all those areas that I mentioned. But if you have an underlying chronic disease of some kind, then that does not apply to you. Alcohol can actually be harmful to you. These benefits that are identified through this study of reducing risk of certain types of chronic diseases are only observed when you're drinking a limited quantity of alcohol. And for those individuals in the study, that was between 1 and 2 drinks, but certainly no more than 2 drinks. So if you're a person who's able to moderate your alcohol use in that manner, and you're over the age of 40, and you don't have any chronic health issues that are underlying, you may realize some of those benefits. But I want to talk a little bit about how those benefits can actually convert into risks or harms if a person transitions to heavy use of alcohol. So if a person who is over the age of 40 and does not have underlying health conditions transitions from moderate alcohol use to heavy alcohol use at some point in time, not only do those potential health benefits on cardiovascular wellness and protective factors against diabetes vanish, but they are actually replaced with a number of health risks that are important to be aware of. So individuals who drink heavily are at risk for hypertension or high blood pressure. They're also at risk of liver disease, and they're also, importantly, at risk of the development of addiction. One other thing that I want to point out is that sometimes when people are given guidelines as to what constitutes healthy alcohol use, so in this case, I mentioned that 1 to 2 drinks and no more than 2 drinks per day constitutes what we would consider moderate alcohol use according to this study. I want to add that to our guidelines from the National Institutes of Health and from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, also known as SAMHSA, around what is moderate drinking, because sometimes people throw that term moderate. Oh, if you drink moderately, there's actually a potential for some health benefits. But do you know what moderate alcohol use actually looks like? So to do moderate alcohol use properly, you have to actually know what counts as a drink and measure what 1 to 2 drinks actually means. And 1 to 2 drinks is a recommendation that is not the same for men versus women. So for women, moderate alcohol use is up to 7 drinks per week and no more. For men, it's up to 14 drinks per week and no more. But the number of drinks you consume on a given day actually matters. So it's an average of 1 drink per day for a woman, adding up to no more than 7, and an average of 2 drinks per day for men, adding up to no more than 14. And sometimes when people hear these guidelines, they think, okay, so I'm a woman, I can have 7 drinks per week, and then I wait until Friday night and have 6. The moderate drinking guidelines do not apply in that way. So you can't cumulatively save up your drinks and drink them all in one night, because that is actually considered binge drinking, and binge drinking carries quite a few health and safety risks as well. So it literally is no more than 1 drink on any given day for women and no more than 2 drinks on any given day for men when you're talking about those cumulative totals. Okay, so now I'd like to talk about how you measure what 1 drink actually means. There are guidelines for determining what 1 drink really amounts to in terms of the quantity of liquid that you're consuming and the type of drink that you're consuming. So when we're talking about beer, regular beer, we're talking about 12 ounces of beer. When we're talking about wine, it's 5 ounces of wine. So if you like to pour a really tall glass of wine, that might actually be 7 or 8 ounces. That's a drink and a half, and that makes a difference, right? Because our guidelines, according to that study, are between 1 and 2 drinks. If you're drinking distilled spirits, it's 1.5 ounces. So if you like to pour a double shot, then that is 2 drinks, and that has to count as 2 drinks. You're done after that 1 drink that was actually 2 drinks. And it's important to measure it that way so that you can get a sense as to whether you fall into this heavy drinking pattern or zone, and whether you should be concerned about the quantity of alcohol that you're consuming. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of how much is actually too much, because there are great resources on the website from the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism and IAAA. There's a resource called Rethinking Drinking that will really help define and break down what all of the different metrics and measurements of different types of drinks with different quantities of alcohol in them are, so that you could better track how much you are truly drinking and see how that stands up to some of these guidelines that I'm discussing. But it's not only about the quantity, because there's a really strong psychological component to an alcohol use disorder, what we know as alcoholism in layman's terms. And that is the extent to which a person feels like they can control their use of alcohol. So apart from the quantity, how do you feel about the way that your drinking unfolds? Do you feel like when you want to limit yourself to 1 or 2 drinks, you're able to do that without a problem? Or do you easily lose count or lose control of that? Do you make rules for yourself and say, okay, I'm not going to drink more than this, or I'm not going to get intoxicated tonight, and find yourself breaking those rules? Because if you do, then those are signs that are indicative that you might be developing or might already have a problem related to your alcohol use. And when you transition from being a social drinker into that zone where you're having a hard time controlling it, you're not really keeping to the rules that you're making for yourself, you are potentially missing out on other important things in your life as a result of your use of alcohol. Maybe you're getting a little too hungover to attend something you promised to attend. Maybe you're just not feeling great, and that's impacting your mood and making you irritable around people you care about. All of these are signs that you may have a problem related to your alcohol use, and that alcohol is not having a positive impact on your health. Because remember that your health is not only your cardiovascular well-being and your status in regard to whether or not you have type 1 or 2 diabetes, but it's also how you are feeling mentally and emotionally, and how you're functioning across the many domains of life in which we have important roles: at work, at home, with family, and even the extent to which you are engaging in enjoyable activities and pleasurable activities and hobbies in your life. I cover a lot of these types of themes in my upcoming book, Addiction: What Everyone Needs to Know, which is now available for pre-sale on my website and on Amazon. And if this topic interests you, if you feel that you want to learn more about how you would know if you have an alcohol use disorder and what can be done about it, the types of treatments that are available, how people go about successfully changing their use of alcohol, please go to my website or to Amazon and pre-order your copy. I look forward to seeing you next time when we will talk about the impacts of alcohol use on women and women's health. I'll see you then.